Her purse didn't fall, it was kicked, with casual precision, by a flight attendant who didn't bother to look twice, the leather skidding down the aisle like a discarded object as eyes turned, and not one hand moved to help. She stood there, a black woman dressed in quiet elegance, caught in a storm of polite indifference, her presence treated as a disruption rather than a passenger with a place. This wasn't turbulence in the sky. It was something colder, more practiced. Whispers followed her down the narrow aisle, paired with glances that didn't hide their weight. What began as a simple flight would unravel into something far more brutal, where every step forward was met with a rule she'd never heard, a standard suddenly enforced, a boundary moved just out of reach. Yet beneath her silence was a presence waiting to unfold, a truth so sharp that when it emerged, it would not just cut, it would turn everything inside out. Want to know what really happened before the wheels even touched down? Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your thoughts might just change the way this story ends. The terminal buzzed with muted energy as travelers shuffled between gates, dragging wheeled bags, balancing paper cups of coffee, and glancing up at glowing monitors. Gate B17 sign flashed, pre-boarding, complete Group 1 now boarding. And Delilah Mercer stood quietly near the front of the priority boarding lane, one hand gripping her phone, the other holding a dark navy blazer slung over her arm. She wasn't dressed to draw attention, but heads turned anyway. A slim figure, sharp lines in her press slacks, a charcoal blouse buttoned neatly at the collar, and low black heels that clicked once on the polished tile as she stepped forward when her group was called. The woman behind the gate's counter narrowed her eyes, her name badge reading Lynn in bold font beneath a metal airline logo. Delilah offered her ticket calmly. The woman took it without a word, scanned it, then paused. A quick flick of her eyes moved from the name on the screen to Delilah's face. She gave nothing back, no smile, no routine welcome aboard, not even a mechanical thank you. Instead, she handed back the boarding pass with a gesture that was almost dismissive, her fingers barely brushing Delilah's palm before turning her attention to the next passenger. Delilah walked the jet bridge alone. She had boarded early with her group, as was her right as a first-class passenger, but the long aluminum tunnel felt colder than usual, the air a little more stale. She was used to walking into rooms where she wasn't expected, deal rooms, boardrooms, government buildings, but the expression she had seen on the gate agent's face stuck in her mind. It hadn't been confusion. It had been calculation. As she stepped onto the plane, the first thing she noticed wasn't the usual pleasant scent of leather seats or the welcoming voice of an attendant. It was silence. Not a silence of calm or order, but a silence filled with eyes. Two crew members stood at the forward galley, arranging trays. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid. The other was shorter, red-headed, her name badge tucked partially behind her apron. Both looked up as Delilah entered. Neither spoke. There was a slight hesitation, a moment too long where they should have smiled or nodded, but instead they just looked at her face, her clothes, her hands. The redhead turned slightly and leaned toward her colleague. Something was whispered. Neither laughed. They simply turned back to their work, leaving Delilah to move forward alone. She reached seat 1A by the window. It was clean, polished, the cream leather cushions gleaming faintly under the cabin lighting. She placed her blazer carefully over the armrest, slid her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her, and sat down, straightening her spine and folding her hands in her lap. The curtain separating first class from the boarding door rustled as more passengers filtered in. The man across the aisle took his seat with a heavy sigh, glancing at Delilah once before turning away. Moments later, a flight attendant appeared beside him, her smile wide and practiced. She offered him a drink, champagne, water, orange juice. He took a flute of sparkling wine. She handed him a warm towel, nodding as he thanked her. She turned, glanced briefly at Delilah, and moved on. No offer, no eye contact, not even a blink of acknowledgement. The silence continued. A woman arrived for seat 1B beside Delilah and hesitated when she saw who she'd be sitting next to. She adjusted her designer bag, looked down at her own ticket, and then stepped aside as if considering whether to ask a crew member for clarification. She said nothing, ultimately, and slid into the seat beside Delilah with a tight expression and averted gaze. As she settled, she pushed her own tote into the shared foot space, her elbow extending beyond the armrest. Delilah said nothing. She leaned slightly toward the window, leaving space not because she was uncomfortable, but because she had learned the value of keeping to herself when it was clear she was not welcome. A moment later, the red-headed attendant returned, this time with a small silver tray and another round of drinks for passengers on the other side of the cabin. As she moved from row to row, her tone was light, her smile returning with each interaction. Delilah waited, watching quietly. When the attendant reached her row, she hesitated again. Her eyes flicked to Delilah, then to the woman seated beside her. She addressed only the latter. Would she like a beverage? She answered quickly and was served. Then the tray vanished, and the attendant moved on, again without a glance at Delilah. Across the aisle, the elderly couple in seats 1C and 1D were being offered headphones, meal menus, and extra pillows. Delilah caught the faint sound of the attendant's laughter as she chatted with them about their honeymoon anniversary trip. The woman leaned forward, commenting on how lovely the airline service always was. Delilah turned back to her own seat, adjusted the waistband of her slacks, and took a deep breath. The curtain closed behind the final passenger as boarding completed. The crew secured the cabin, but not once had any of them stopped to speak to Delilah. Not to confirm her name, not to ask if she needed anything, not even to verify her seat. She sat perfectly still, her posture composed, her expression neutral. She looked out the window again and watched as a luggage cart rumbled past, disappearing behind the wing. The flight attendants continued their fluid motions, tending to passengers around her, but always stopping short of her row, like her seat existed behind an invisible wall. Her presence was a wrinkle in the flow, and the staff, seasoned and practiced, knew exactly how to smooth around her. Then it happened, fast and with no warning. A flight attendant, tall, wiry, moving briskly with a tray tucked under one arm, clipped the edge of Delilah's carry-on bag. It was positioned properly, tucked beneath the seat ahead of her, just as required. But the attendant wasn't watching. His foot struck the corner of the soft case, and instead of stopping, he turned with a sharp movement, muttered something under his breath, and drove his foot into the side of the bag. The bag skidded out from beneath the seat like a kickball, rolling quickly down the aisle, bumped by shoes and cabin debris, bouncing over the carpet seam between first and business class. Delilah turned her head, startled. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched it slide farther, disappearing around the edge of the curtain at the front of the economy cabin. The attendant didn't look back. He kept walking, moving on to serve drinks in business class, as if nothing had happened. Delilah sat frozen for a moment, unsure if anyone would react. Surely someone had seen it. Surely someone would step in, recover it, offer an apology. But there was only silence. The woman seated beside her opened a magazine and turned a page loudly. Another passenger across the aisle adjusted his pillow and closed his eyes. One flight attendant glanced back, then quickly turned away. No apology came. No acknowledgement. A single pointed pause, and then indifference. Delilah unbuckled her seatbelt, stood quietly, and began walking down the aisle. Her shoes made soft clicks on the carpet, muffled by the cabin noise. She kept her head up, her shoulders squared, but her hands were clenched tightly at her sides. She passed rows of reclined passengers, their eyes flicking up momentarily before gliding past her, as if she were part of a service crew instead of a fellow traveler. She didn't belong to their category. She didn't warrant concern. Near row 10, the bag came into view, wedged awkwardly between a seat and the base of a cart. She knelt to retrieve it, her knees pressed against the cabin floor, one hand steadying herself on the seat cushion. As she pulled the bag free, a child too rose, a head pointed and laughed. His mother whispered something into his ear, not to correct him, but to hush him. Delilah's ears burned, but she said nothing. She zipped the main pocket closed where it had come slightly open, hiding the edge of a file folder and a half-read book. The noise of conversation continued around her, uninterested and unaffected. She stood slowly, straightened her blouse, and turned to return to her seat. But the path back was no longer clear. Somewhere in the short time it had taken her to walk forward, the flight crew had drawn the curtain across the entry to first class. It wasn't closed gently either. It hung taut, snapped into place at both edges. Delilah stopped, unsure whether to push it aside or wait. She hesitated, then reached for it. But before she could part the fabric, a hand touched her wrist. A voice, low and casual, spoke from behind her. A man seated at the bulkhead leaned slightly into the aisle, his eyes half-lidded with amusement. He told her that the front section was for first-class passengers only, not crew or economy. She looked at him, startled. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. The man smiled as if offering a helpful correction, then turned back to his screen. Behind him, someone chuckled. A younger voice, full of mockery. Delilah parted the curtain anyway. She stepped through, slowly, deliberately, and immediately felt the cabin narrow. The air behind the fabric was thinner, colder. As she passed back into first class, the attendant with red hair turned and raised an eyebrow, as though surprised to see her return. No one offered to take the bag from her. No one stepped aside to help. Her path down the aisle felt longer than before, each step drawing attention she never asked for. Her face remained composed, but her cheeks had warmed with the heat of shame. When she reached her row, the woman in seat 1B was sprawled slightly into her space, her tablet propped up, her feet braced on the footrest in front of her. Delilah paused. The woman didn't move. Eventually, with visible reluctance, she lifted one leg, turned slightly, and allowed Delilah the smallest space to pass. Delilah squeezed in, placed the carry-on beneath her seat again, and sat down in silence. The bag was scuffed now. The zipper handle was bent. A black smudge from the cart wheel marred the fabric. She stared at it, her breathing shallow, her heart thudding dully beneath her ribs. The curtain behind her remained closed. From this side, it was silent again. Whatever noise traveled through the rest of the plane felt muffled, distant. In this section, there was only the faint clicking of ice and glasses, pages turning, the low hum of filtered air. No one looked at her. No one acknowledged her return. She was again invisible, but now bruised with a fresh, quiet humiliation. It wasn't the inconvenience of the bag, or the smirk from a stranger, or the closed curtain. It was the layered message underneath it all. You are here, but you do not belong. You are here, but only until someone corrects the mistake. You are here, but we will not see you. It was not a courtesy extended to someone like her on this flight. As the captain's voice filtered overhead announcing clear skies and calm air, the chief flight attendant approached with the tight-lipped professionalism of someone delivering bad news under a performance of neutrality. She paused just beside Delilah's row, but didn't address her directly. Instead, she tapped her tablet and stared at it, pretending to confirm information she already knew. Delilah looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. The attendant spoke without meeting her eyes. She stated that due to a last-minute reassignment, Delilah would need to move. There was no apology, no offer of assistance, no explanation. Just a directive wrapped in faux formality. Her seat had been given to another. The way the words were spoken made it sound procedural, like luggage being rerouted at a carousel. Delilah blinked once, digesting the command. She opened her mouth to ask why, but the attendant was already glancing at another passenger standing in the aisle nearby, a man with salt and pepper hair and a tailored jacket that looked recently steamed. He stood with a smug, expectant air, eyes darting past her as if she were part of the scenery being cleared for his comfort. The attendant gestured for him to wait, then turned back to Delilah and repeated her direction. She used words like reassignment and temporary inconvenience, but there was no room for negotiation. It was a removal dressed in etiquette. Delilah's heart thudded once, sharply, then dropped into her stomach. She knew that if she resisted, she would be painted difficult. If she asked questions, she would be labeled aggressive. So she nodded once, slowly, and gathered her things again with measured movements, refusing to show the sting behind her eyes. She stood, stepped out into the aisle, and began walking down the length of the cabin. Her blazer draped over her arm, her carry-on again trailing behind her, one wheel slightly stiff from the earlier impact. She passed rows of reclining passengers who barely acknowledged her existence. One woman lifted her glass to take a sip of wine and watched Delilah with quiet disdain over the rim, as if the act of walking through the first-class cabin had stained the air. Delilah reached the thick curtain separating cabins and pushed through. The fabric was heavier than it looked, clinging to her back for a moment before falling closed, sealing her out. The business-class cabin was quiet, and her heels clicked louder on the thinner carpet. As she moved past another row, a male attendant leaned toward a colleague and nodded in her direction. His voice was hushed, but not enough. The phrase he used wasn't unfamiliar. It had been said to her before many times in offices, in stores, in lobbies. That look, that tone, that subtle mockery wrapped in coded language. She heard the smirk in it, even if she didn't catch every word. The woman beside him laughed softly, her eyes gliding from Delilah's face to her shoes, then up to her hair, then to the frayed corner of her luggage tag, where the initials DLM had begun to peel away. They didn't try to hide their assessment. They didn't need to. Delilah kept walking, her breath measured, each step as deliberate as a chess move. When she reached the rear of business, another crew member, young, with short cropped hair and a headset clipped to his collar, stepped into her path. He raised a hand, palm out, as though she had wandered somewhere she didn't belong. She explained briefly and calmly that she had been reassigned, that she was told to continue to the rear. He didn't respond, just tapped the device in his hand and waved toward the back of the plane. There was no seat number given, no aisle directed, just a vague gesture, a clearance to proceed, as if she were a misplaced package rather than a passenger. She entered economy, the air denser, the light colder. The sounds were louder here, babies crying, plastic wrappers crinkling, overhead bins slamming. The aisle narrowed, the space tightened. Delilah's chest did the same. As she passed row after row, eyes followed her. A man with sunglasses hanging from the collar of his t-shirt leaned sideways and muttered a comment to the person next to him, just loud enough to drift into her space. She didn't react, but the words dug in. It was the tone, always the tone, that carved the deepest grooves. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking about her. She had become a lesson, a warning, a disruption to be joked about. His laughter trailed after her like smoke. When she finally reached the rear cabin, a woman in an aisle seat stood with a confused expression, looking down at a boarding pass and then up at Delilah, as if unsure whether she was being asked to move. An attendant appeared, looked at the chart, then pointed to a seat wedged between two strangers halfway down the row. Delilah maneuvered into the space, her shoulders brushing against one armrest and then the other. The man to her left was already asleep, his legs spread, headphones over his ears. The woman to her right held a magazine and didn't bother shifting to give Delilah room. She slid into the seat, placed her carry-on beneath her legs, and folded her hands in her lap. The back of the seat in front of her was smudged with fingerprints. The tray table rattled when touched. Her knees pressed against the hard plastic. She had gone from silence to suffocation. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back slightly as though asleep, but the tension in his shoulders said otherwise. His elbow jutted into her space, and he occasionally gave a slight twitch, pretending it was unintentional. To her right, the passenger in the window seat, a woman with earbuds in and a jacket draped over her lap, curled closer to the sidewall, not out of consideration for Delilah, but to avoid contact entirely. Delilah tried to sit without touching anyone, minimizing her presence, folding herself inward, but the effort left her breath shallow and her limbs aching. She had once been seated in a leather chair with legroom, with warmth, with service and silence, and now she was here, boxed in and forgotten. A subtle pulse of humiliation throbbed in her temples, steady and relentless. When the drink cart began to roll down the aisle, the familiar clatter of bottles and plastic cups echoed like a cruel drumbeat. Delilah didn't particularly want anything. Her throat was tight, and the sour taste of injustice lingered. But asking for a glass of water felt like an assertion of presence, like a small reclamation of identity. As the cart neared her row, she glanced up, expecting a pause, some brief acknowledgement, a nod. Instead, the attendant reached across her to hand ginger ale to the man beside her. She waited, poised politely, then opened her mouth to speak. The attendant was already turning. The cart moved to the next row. No words were exchanged. No eye contact made. No offering extended. Her hands curled into her lap, and she sat back slowly. Her lips remained parted for a second longer than they should have, as if she was still mid-sentence, but nothing had ever been allowed to start. The cart continued, rattling farther down the aisle. It didn't come back. The passengers around her sipped their drinks, tore into crinkling snack packets, adjusted the recline of their seats with a relaxed familiarity that seemed miles away from the tension she held inside. Delilah shifted her gaze to the man beside her. He had taken off his shoes and tucked one foot under the seat ahead of him. His elbow remained planted, firm against the armrest, his breathing now deliberately deep, almost theatrical. He wasn't asleep. He was performing indifference with precision. The message was simple. She would have to be the one to yield. She tried to move her arm, and his elbow shifted an inch, not to make room, but to remind her he had no intention of ceding space. Every gesture, every breath, every second pressed against her like another dismissal. She was here, technically, but not truly seen. Her presence was accepted only so far as it remained silent, small, and compliant. Her removal from first class had not been an isolated moment. It was a process, a sequence, a quiet stripping away of dignity by degrees. The more she accepted without protest, the more permission it granted. The cold air from the overhead vent trickled across her scalp, and no matter how many times she adjusted the dial, it continued to drift downward, persistent and impersonal. The light above her was dimmer than the others, or perhaps it just felt that way. She looked around. In the row ahead, a woman had a fleece blanket provided by the crew. A child several rows back had received a small snack tray with extra crackers and juice. A man behind her had asked for a second drink and received it without hesitation. Delilah sat with her hands folded, her throat dry, her stomach empty, and her dignity fraying one silent moment at a time. She had said nothing, not because she lacked the words, but because she had seen the cost of using them. To ask was to risk rebuke. To insist was to risk accusation. And to protest, even politely, would trigger something far more vicious than mere exclusion. So she stayed quiet. She breathed evenly. She stared at the seat ahead of her and tried to forget the feeling of leather under her fingertips, of a curtain that once closed behind her, of a seat that had belonged to her until someone decided she didn't deserve it. Time passed. The hum of the engine filled the cabin like white noise, and the minutes stretched longer than they should have. Delilah shifted in her seat, discreetly trying to relieve the pressure building in her hip from the narrow space. The man beside her exhaled sharply, a passive-aggressive sigh, as though she had disturbed his non-existent sleep. She glanced at him, but his eyes remained closed. The woman by the window had turned her head away, lost in whatever music pulsed through her earbuds. Delilah didn't move again. She sat rigid, her back barely touching the seat, her posture straight not from comfort, but from the unspoken need to occupy less. Less space, less time, less existence. Everything about the situation was designed to communicate her displacement, not just physically from one seat to another, but existentially, from a place of respect to a place of erasure. Another flight attendant passed, pushing a second cart with trash collection. Delilah lifted her hand slightly, hoping to ask for water this time. The attendant was already turning away, and the moment vanished. She lowered her hand again, unsure whether it had been noticed or ignored. The tray table in front of her rattled with the turbulence of the passing cart, and she pressed her fingers against it until it stopped. The edge bit into her palm, grounding her. She could still feel the stares from earlier, the whispers, the smirks, the eyes that didn't see her except when judging. The shame clung to her like static, every inch of her clothing suddenly too tight, too visible, too exposed. She thought of her blazer, now stuffed into the crammed overhead bin above seat 42A, wrinkling with every bounce of the aircraft. She thought of her bag, still bearing the scuff from the drink cart wheel, sitting beneath her feet like a silent witness to the quiet violence of this flight. She thought of her name, once printed on the manifest with the bold designation of first class, now reduced to an anomaly someone had corrected without accountability. Delilah blinked slowly, her breath shallow. She didn't feel rage. Not yet. Not even anger. What she felt was deeper. A bone-deep weariness. The kind of fatigue that came not from movement, but from being constantly pushed backward. Not from shouting, but from swallowing what should have been spoken. Her silence had become her armor, but it was heavy, and with every skipped glance and ignored request, it cracked in places she couldn't repair. The attendant stopped beside her row, leaning slightly in with a forced expression of concern stretched thin over something else. He held the boarding pass between two fingers and tilted it slightly, as if unsure what to do with it. Then, without so much as greeting her, he announced that there had been a complication with the record. The boarding pass, he claimed, didn't match the updated manifest. It was now flagged, possibly invalid, and might require verification. He held it aloft for a moment longer, ensuring that nearby passengers could see it, the bold printed seat assignment visible beneath the airline logo. A woman across the aisle glanced up from her tablet. The man beside Delilah shifted slightly, just enough to glance sideways at the paper, then at her face. The message was clear without being spoken. Suspicion had returned, legitimacy was again in question, and Delilah was once more reduced to a discrepancy in a system that never accepted her. She reached for the paper, but the attendant continued his explanation, flipping the pass in his hand and pointing to a faint crease along the corner. It looked damp, as though placed on a wet surface, the ink slightly smudged. He asked, casually but audibly, where she had gotten it. Delilah met his eyes with a steady gaze, but said nothing. She didn't need to. The implication hovered between them like static, and the silence in her row deepened. Finally, the attendant handed her the boarding pass, crumpled and cold from whatever surface it had rested on. She took it carefully, flattened it once against her thigh, then folded it and returned it to her bag without expression. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, but inside her chest, something twisted. The attendant left without a word, walking back toward the front of the cabin with the same disinterested efficiency he'd carried with him down the aisle. No apology, no explanation, no correction. Just another inspection masked as procedure, a performance of order that served only to highlight her difference. The passengers around her returned to their screens, their books, their headphones. But the mood had shifted. She could feel the discomfort emanating from the woman to her right, who now leaned more toward the window. The man on her left tugged his jacket tighter over his lap and gave her more elbow room, not from courtesy, but from quiet caution, as if proximity might invite implication. Minutes passed. The hum of the engines and the murmur of conversation filled the cabin, broken occasionally by a service announcement or the clink of a glass against a tray. Delilah stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her lips pressed in a thin line. She thought of how simple it would be to speak, to stand, to demand recognition for what she was enduring. But the cost still lingered in her mind like a warning. She knew that standing up in this moment would not bring justice. It would bring attention. And attention, as experience had taught her, came with accusation. From the front of the economy section, another crew member emerged. This one held a navy blazer folded neatly over one arm. Delilah recognized it immediately. It was hers. She had placed it in the first class overhead bin hours ago. She had not asked for its return. The attendant said nothing as she approached. She held the blazer at arm's length, dangling it forward as though it were a forgotten item at a coat check. Delilah reached out and took it, thanking her softly even though no one had spoken. She laid it across her lap and immediately noticed the change in texture. A darker stain stretched across the left sleeve, sticky and discolored. She lifted it slightly and caught the unmistakable scent, ginger ale or something close to it, dried into the fabric. The material was wrinkled now, creased along the edge, as though pressed beneath something heavy. She turned it over, inspecting a lapel, and found a faint impression from a cup lid, as if someone had used it as a coaster during service. The attendant remained for a breath, watched her expression, then shrugged and walked away. No words, no acknowledgement. The implication was obvious. She could wear it if she wanted, or not. Delilah held the blazer in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the stain, then closing around the folded fabric. It was another gesture, small but cutting. Another item returned not with care, but as an afterthought. Another piece of herself mishandled and dismissed. Her blazer, once sharp and pressed, now lay limp, tainted, and reeking of casual disregard. She folded it carefully anyway, smoothing the edges, making it neat again as best she could. She placed it beside her bag and let her hands rest once more in her lap. The sounds around her grew louder. The flight attendants began another service round, this time with customs forms and trash bags. Passengers grumbled over meals and tray tables, but no one looked her way. Delilah sat still, watching the line of people receiving forms, cups, attention. When the attendant reached her row, he offered forms to the man beside her and to the woman near the window. Then, with one glance at her, he moved on. No form, no words, just a look. She felt a cold spread deeper in her chest, the kind that wasn't about temperature, but about invisibility. She was there, fully present, fully aware. And still, they passed her, as if she were an echo of someone once worthy, now rewritten. She turned her face back toward the window, though the view offered nothing but haze. Her reflection barely registered in the smudged glass. She watched the clouds below shift like folds in a rumpled sheet, endless and unreachable. The ache in her chest had turned to something denser, a kind of internal weight that no posture could disguise. Her spine stayed straight. Her expression remained composed. But inside, she felt like something was slipping loose, something foundational. Not just the dignity they denied her, but the belief that it could be reclaimed by staying silent. She hadn't moved since the last attendant walked away, the crumpled boarding pass still tucked into the side of her bag like a dismissed truth no one would admit. Around her, the activity of the cabin continued. Passengers murmured complaints about meal options, tapped on tablet screens, and shifted in their seats with the restless energy of a long flight. But Delilah remained still, a deliberate island amid motion, waiting for the storm she knew hadn't yet ended. The moment came without warning, like so many before it. A crew member reappeared, this time with a colleague, their approach slow and purposeful. They stopped just short of a row, and one of them leaned in, his voice pitched low enough to sound polite, but loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. He explained that there had been an internal alert, a follow-up related to her previous seating issue. The airline, he said, had specific standards for presentation in its premium cabins. Delilah blinked once, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. He clarified, still using soft words and an almost gentle tone, that her clothing might not meet those standards. Her blouse, he noted, was a bit informal. Her slacks, while clean, weren't tailored to first-class expectations. Her shoes, flat, black, and polished, were described as casual. He glanced briefly at her stained blazer, and the faintest twitch of judgment crossed his expression. She sat motionless, her heart pounding once against her ribs before settling into a rhythm that matched the dull roar of the engines. She said nothing. To argue was to invite escalation. To question was to give them ammunition. A passenger across the aisle turned and openly stared, his expression shifting from curiosity to smug recognition. A man in a gray business suit 2 rows ahead chuckled audibly, not even bothering to mask it. He leaned toward his seatmate and muttered something that made her cover her mouth to stifle a laugh. Delilah's face burned, but she didn't flinch. She didn't ask which part of her attire had violated the unspoken dress code. She didn't demand a list of accepted garments. She knew that no answer would come. The accusation wasn't about fabric. It was about presence. The attendant offered a solution, almost as an afterthought. If she preferred, she could remain where she was for the duration of the flight, and her complaint could be forwarded post-arrival. His tone implied he doubted there would be a complaint. He stepped back with a tight smile and walked away, his colleague trailing behind him without a word. The business class passenger across from her watched the entire exchange with open amusement, then turned to his laptop with a shake of his head. Delilah stared at the seat back ahead, her reflection faint in the smudged screen of the in-flight monitor. The fabric of her blouse, cotton blend clean pressed, had suddenly become a violation. The shoes she had worn in countless meetings across marble floors and into government offices were now inadequate. The blazer, stained not by her carelessness but by theirs, had become a symbol of inferiority. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling every eye that had witnessed the exchange and every pair that would pretend they hadn't. A slow ache began to build at the base of her neck, spreading downward into her shoulders. Her throat felt dry, but she didn't reach for water. She wouldn't ask again. The moments passed, and the shame settled into a heavier weight, layered over the previous ones like sediment on stone. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She simply endured. But her skin itched beneath the judgment, and the silence felt louder than any insult. Time passed, and eventually she stood. Her body was stiff from disuse, and she moved with quiet precision. She stepped into the aisle, adjusted the strap of her bag, and began walking forward. Her destination wasn't dramatic or confrontational. She just needed to use the restroom. The one at the back was occupied, with a line already formed near the galley, and she remembered the one at the front of the plane near the original first-class cabin, where she'd been seated before the reassignment. Her steps were calm, unhurried. She walked up the aisle, each row passing in her peripheral vision like silent spectators. No one spoke. No one stopped her. She reached the midpoint of the cabin and continued forward. But as she neared the front section, the curtain that separated the classes was once again drawn, a barrier more symbolic than functional. Delilah reached to part it, the fabric brushing her hand. Before she could step through, two attendants appeared almost simultaneously. They weren't running, but their pace was quick, their movements efficient. They each pushed a service cart in front of them, and in perfect coordination, they pulled the carts across the narrow passageway, physically blocking the aisle with polished chrome and plastic trays. One of them looked up and gave her a tight, clearly forced smile. He explained, in that same practiced tone, that the front lavatory was reserved for premium passengers only. He gestured to the cart, as if it had appeared coincidentally, but the synchronization was too exact. It had been deliberate. The statement wasn't policy. It was exclusion. Delilah didn't argue. She didn't protest. She stood still, her body only inches from the carts, her arms at her sides. Her presence filled the narrow space, and the pause stretched long enough for the moment to feel like a tableau. A single figure, undesired, standing at a gate that had once been open. The air between them was tense, but still. The flight attendant held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. The message had been delivered. The other attendant didn't speak. He just waited, hands resting lightly on the cart handle, his stance unyielding. The seconds ticked past. Finally, Delilah turned. She didn't glance back. She walked slowly, without hurry, back toward the middle of the cabin, her face expressionless. The moment behind her faded, but its impact did not. As she passed by rows of occupied seats, passengers shifted subtly, making space without being asked, but also without acknowledgement. The space they gave was laced with discomfort, not kindness. She returned to her row, slid past the silent passengers, and sat back down. The window offered only clouds, endless and blank. The cabin offered only noise. She leaned back, letting the headrest cradle her spine, and closed her eyes for a moment. Not to rest, not to sleep, but to recover a sliver of control. Time aboard this flight had warped, stretching with each small humiliation, contracting with each act of erasure. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, the fabric of her slacks still faintly sticky along one thigh from the jacket she had wiped earlier, trying and failing to clean the stain from the ginger ale incident. Every muscle in her body ached with stillness, a fatigue that came not from motion, but from enduring. Then came the final spark, the kind so small and innocent in execution, yet monumental in consequence. The child in the row ahead was restless, his voice bubbling with excitement as he adjusted in his seat. He turned to peer over the headrest, smiling wide, his cup of orange juice clutched in both hands. His enthusiasm wasn't the problem. He was young, curious. It was the moment that followed, the turbulence, slight and sudden, the cup tipping forward, its contents spilling with effortless certainty over the lip of the seat and cascading into Delilah's lap. The sensation was instant, cold, sticky, saturating the front of her blouse and soaking through to her slacks. She inhaled sharply, not from shock, but from the immediate understanding that there would be no reaction equal to the impact. The child's eyes widened, and he immediately whispered an apology, his little voice trembling. Delilah met his gaze with composure, giving the smallest nod to ease his visible guilt. She didn't blame him. He didn't know what the day had cost her already. It was not his action, but everything surrounding it that fractured something deep within her. The child's mother turned slowly, surveying the damage with detached curiosity. She did not apologize. She didn't offer help. Instead, she sighed and reached into her oversized tote to retrieve a screen for the child, pressing play on a cartoon with one hand while adjusting her seat with the other. Delilah sat drenched in citrus, eyes still fixed on the boy, not with anger, but with a stillness that was almost unnatural. From the aisle, a flight attendant who had seen the spill approached, holding a single napkin, already half crumpled, moisture curling the edges from the heat of the galley. She handed it to Delilah with a strained smile, as if hoping to defuse a situation that had yet to ignite. Delilah took the napkin without speaking. She dabbed once at her lap, then placed it carefully on the tray table in front of her. No apology came, no second offer. The attendant disappeared without another word. The cabin returned to its hum, the passengers around her shifting back into the warmth of their own distractions. Delilah did not move. She did not fidget. She sat still, her eyes fixed ahead, and something within her began to change. Not rage, not sorrow, not even protest, just a sharp internal stillness that wrapped itself around her spine and pulled her posture into perfect alignment. Her chin lifted, her shoulders set, and the silence she had been holding, full of effort, measured breath, and endurance, transformed. It was no longer a shield. It became something else entirely. The weight in her chest crystallized into clarity. She reached slowly into the front compartment of her bag and withdrew a small leather card case. The stitching along its edges had frayed slightly from years of use, but the embossed initials on its surface still gleamed faintly. She opened it and pulled out a single business card, white and heavy with crisp black lettering. Her fingers moved deliberately. She retrieved her phone, unlocked it, and began typing. Her face was unreadable, not because it was empty, but because it now carried intention, focus. The quiet beneath her expression had shifted from containment to purpose. The letters she typed were not rushed. Each keystroke was a thread, stitching back together the parts of herself they had tried to unravel. She glanced once at the time, then pressed send. A single message, direct, calculated, and irreversible. No one noticed what she had done. The flight attendants continued their route, offering water, checking trays, moving past her row with the same practiced oversight. The mother of the child remained absorbed in her screen. The man beside her adjusted his headphones. The air around Delilah remained unchanged, but inside, the atmosphere had thickened. The silence she projected now felt different, dense, defined, the kind that draws attention not by volume, but by gravity. A ripple had started. It moved through her chest first, then her hands, steadying her as she placed her phone on the tray and reached for her blazer. She didn't put it on. Instead, she held it in her lap, her thumb tracing the edge of the stained fabric. The scent of orange and sugar clung to her, but she no longer flinched from it. The smell no longer marked shame. It marked the end. For hours she had endured, allowing each slight, each exclusion, each policy and performance of indifference to pass over her like rain on stone. She had measured her voice, her gestures, her breath. But no one noticed what they were doing. No one noticed how carefully she had stayed within the lines they drew for her, how silently she had accepted their judgment. They thought they had removed her, diminished her, rendered her invisible. Delilah noticed it without appearing to look. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, unblinking, but the ripple that had begun within her had now reached the very edges of the cabin. The silence she had carried for so long had left her voice, transformed into action. Words typed, sent, and received. The wheels were already in motion. She did not smile. She did not nod. She simply waited. The plane began its initial descent, a low chime sounding overhead as seatbelt lights blinked to life and passengers shifted in their seats. Some reached for overhead bags. Others pushed tray tables back into place. The cabin crew moved swiftly, checking rows, reminding passengers to return seats upright. But even in the orchestrated flurry of descent, something was off. Attendants whispered to each other more urgently than before. A second voice crackled in a nearby earpiece. A clipboard changed hands. One attendant disappeared into the cockpit, returned with a different expression, tense, alert. Delilah didn't move. Her phone rested in her lap now, screen dim. The message she had sent already received and read. She had not expected a reply. She had not needed one. The chain of command would take care of the rest. She was not just a passenger. And now they knew. The hum of the cabin had changed subtly, and the murmur of passengers around her grew quiet as the air shifted, like a collective inhalation before impact. Some noticed the change in tone. Others simply looked up from their devices, their senses attuned to something beneath the surface. In row 3, a man in a pressed suit glanced toward the front and frowned. In the back galley, a tray of drinks meant for final service was suddenly pulled from rotation. The attendant who had once handed her a damp napkin now stood at the edge of the aisle, staring into space for half a second too long before moving again. His composure was cracking. He hadn't yet placed why, but something had turned, and they felt it, all of them, especially the ones who had most fervently ignored her. Especially those who had smiled without sincerity and passed her by like shadow. She sat without leaning back, her frame upright but relaxed, her expression unchanged. She had said nothing. She had not called anyone out. She had not caused a scene. But the flight manifest had been updated, and someone high enough had taken notice. Not because of a video, not because of social media, because of who she was, because of what she had sent. Because of the name printed in small, clean font on the card tucked inside her bag. The same name that now glowed on a monitor in the cockpit and appeared on the screen in the forward galley. The curtain to the forward cabin parted again. A new attendant emerged, not one she had seen before, likely pulled forward from the upper crew deck. She held a single glass on a small tray, crystal, not plastic. She walked slowly, eyes scanning the rows as if looking for someone specific. As she reached Delilah's row, she paused, and her expression shifted from inquiry to recognition. She stopped directly beside her, inclined her head slightly, and addressed her clearly, quietly, by full name. Not miss, not ma'am, her name, her full name, spoken with a clarity that did not invite misunderstanding. Delilah looked up, met her eyes, and gave a small nod. She accepted the drink without comment. She placed it on the tray table in front of her and looked forward again. The attendant hesitated for a moment longer, then walked away. That small exchange had not gone unnoticed. Passengers nearby, who had once eyed her with boredom or disdain, now glanced toward her with new expressions: confusion, curiosity, discomfort. The man to her left straightened in his seat, his elbows no longer claiming the shared armrest. The woman by the window turned slightly, her earbuds pulled halfway out. Something had happened. Something real. Something undeniable. But no one understood what. Not yet. And still, Delilah remained quiet. Still. In control. She did not flaunt the change in energy. She did not shift her posture to claim new space. She did not smile in vindication. She simply existed now in full view, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. The drink before her remained untouched. It was not an offering. It was not an apology. It was acknowledgement, a recognition of presence, of weight, of authority that had been misjudged and misused. At the front of the cabin, the lead flight attendant reappeared. Her movements were tight, rehearsed, but the practiced ease was gone. Her smile was brittle, her gaze darting. She checked the cabin again, this time slower, more thorough. Her eyes swept over Delilah's row and paused briefly, not long enough to be called a stare, but longer than coincidence. She adjusted her collar and moved on, but her step faltered slightly as she turned. The descent continued. The aircraft dipped smoothly toward its destination, the clouds breaking beneath the wings and revealing the city below, structured, shining, unaware of what was unfolding at 35,000 feet. The captain's voice broke through the intercom, his tone now laced with a professionalism more exacting than before. The language was measured, polished. First names had been replaced with full designations. His welcome message at departure had been casual. This final message felt like a corporate statement. Delilah breathed steadily. Her eyes returned to the glass in front of her, where condensation had begun to form along the rim. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the surface. She touched nothing. She spoke to no one. She allowed the moment to unfold without interruption, knowing that the crew had already been briefed, that internal messages had already spread across the airline's network. What they had seen as an inconvenient passenger in a wrinkled blouse was something else entirely. She had become the one name they would now remember. The silence around her was no longer cold or dismissive. It was tight, dense, filled with a new kind of attention that pressed from every direction. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't made a scene. But the atmosphere of the cabin had turned. Something unspoken buzzed just beneath the surface, an electrical current of tension rippling through the rows like static before storm. She watched without looking as the front curtain shifted once more. A different attendant emerged, not part of the earlier crew. He wore the insignia of a senior team member, the sort rarely seen outside of official incidents. He moved with a crispness that revealed his role in resolving problems that had grown too large for appearances to manage. As he entered the cabin, his eyes scanned carefully, reading posture and expression. He paused briefly at the front of business class before continuing down the aisle with purpose. Behind him, another attendant appeared, whispering something to the lead from earlier, the one who had offered explanations about dress code and policy without flinching. Her face went pale. The whisper ended. She nodded, then disappeared into the galley without a word. The captain's voice broke through the speakers, clearer this time, his tone less casual, more exact. He didn't offer another weather update or a thank you for choosing the airline. Instead, he requested that specific members of the cabin crew report to the flight deck immediately. He named them, by last name. Notaitas. No warm delivery, just precision. The request landed with a weight no one could misinterpret. The passengers around Delilah began to stir, heads turning, eyes glancing between faces, trying to match names to uniforms. Delilah didn't move. Her eyes remained forward, her breath even, her expression unreadable. Moments later, two crew members made their way up the aisle, their posture stiff, their faces neutral in that way that only deep discomfort can produce. They passed Delilah without looking, but their pace slowed as they neared her row. Not hesitation, recognition. One of them had once waved her away from the forward lavatory. The other had commented on her shoes. They walked on, disappearing behind the curtain that marked the boundary between cabin and cockpit. Delilah inhaled slowly, then let the breath out through her nose, her body unmoving, her resolve unwavering. From somewhere near the front, another voice carried faintly, low but urgent. And then a new order came over the speakers. A passenger seated in business class, row 3, was instructed to remain in his seat upon arrival. There would be personnel waiting at the gate. No further explanation was offered, but the passengers near him went still. The man shifted in his seat, turned slightly, and tried to look behind him without making it obvious. His posture changed, from dominant and relaxed to alert and uncertain. Delilah remembered his laugh. The way he had smirked as she had been told her clothing was beneath the airline standard. Now he stared at the seat back in front of him as though it held the answers to a question he hadn't expected to face. Back in economy, one of the flight attendants was no longer working the cabin. Her absence was sudden. Her usual patrol ceased. Her station left empty. A younger attendant now moved with rehearsed precision, following protocol but stealing glances toward the rear galley every few minutes, as though expecting something or someone to emerge. The cart she once pushed now sat parked just ahead of Delilah's row, untouched. No one reached for anything. The senior attendant who had walked the aisle earlier returned now, carrying a tablet and a folded document in one hand. He stopped briefly beside Delilah's row, not facing her directly, not calling her name, but pausing long enough to let presence be acknowledged. He checked the tablet, nodded once to himself, and moved on. No hostility, no clarification. But the weight of the gesture was clear. Her name was on that screen, and it was no longer ignored. It was highlighted, bolded. Whispers began to move through the cabin, weaving between rows like smoke. Passengers murmured softly to one another, exchanging theories, noting the changes in crew behavior, the shifts in protocol, the tension layered beneath every practiced smile. Something had happened. They didn't know what, but the pattern was too obvious to ignore. The earlier arrogance of the cabin staff had vanished. The comfort they once wore like armor had been stripped away. Now they moved differently, sharper, quieter, more aware. One even bent slightly to retrieve a napkin that had fallen beneath the seat, something no one had bothered to do earlier. Delilah watched it all in silence, her face unreadable, not smug, not vengeful, simply composed. The man to her left, who had once dominated the shared armrest, now sat with his arms tucked in close to his body. His posture had shrunk, his presence diminished, and he hadn't tried to meet her gaze since the drink had arrived. The woman at the window, who had once leaned away with dismissive caution, now seemed restless, her eyes flicking between the window and the cabin aisle, her body shifting as though caught between discomfort and curiosity. Delilah let the moment stretch. Her fingers gently traced the edge of the business card tucked into her phone case, her only outward movement in minutes. It had taken only a name, only one push from silence into strategy, to begin what now could not be undone. She had spent hours being minimized, spoken over, questioned, passed. And now, the same systems that had facilitated those slights were mobilizing in reverse. Procedures were being activated, logs reviewed, names noted. Every decision made on that flight was now under scrutiny. The city below grew closer, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled into night. The runway was visible in the distance, a glowing path etched into the earth. The landing gear dropped with a mechanical jolt. The aircraft leveled. The cabin dimmed further, lights lowered in preparation for arrival. And still, Delilah did not move. She didn't need to. Everything she had wanted them to see, they had seen. Everything they needed to know, they now knew. Without protest, without confrontation, only truth, revealed too late for them to control it. The aircraft came to a full stop at the gate, the hiss of depressurizing cabins and the mechanical clunk of doors disengaging echoing softly across the silent rows of seated passengers. The hum of anticipation that usually followed touchdown, the flurry of movement, the eagerness to retrieve overhead bags, the shuffle of shoes against the floor, was notably absent. This time, no one rushed. No one jostled to be first. The plane had landed, but something had yet to settle. The seatbelt sign dinged off. People moved with caution. Uncertainty lingered like mist in the aisles, and eyes shifted in quiet calculations. Delilah remained seated, her posture unchanged. She waited, calm and composed, as those around her began gathering their belongings. The man to her left, who had once filled the space with his elbows and dismissive sighs, now avoided looking at her altogether. His fingers moved nervously along the zipper of his briefcase, his shoulders drawn in, the confidence that once defined his presence now hollow. The woman at the window adjusted her scarf twice, fumbled with her phone, then finally stood, giving Delilah more room than was necessary, as if trying to undo a previous dismissal with silence. Delilah rose slowly, not in defiance, but with measured intention. She reached for her blazer, still creased and faintly stained, draped it neatly over her arm, and stepped into the aisle. The attendants stood near the forward exit, faces tight, shoulders tense, the performance of cheerful farewells replaced by a somber quiet. One by one, as passengers moved past them, nods were exchanged, murmured thank yous offered without conviction. Then she stepped forward. The attendant who had once handed her a crumpled napkin now stood closest to the door. His uniform was still sharp, but his stance betrayed his unease. His eyes lifted, met hers briefly, and then dropped. No script came to his lips. No palist fras. Instead, he shifted slightly, cleared his throat, and spoke in a voice not meant for passengers, but for penance. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rehearsed, but it was real. A simple apology. One more followed. The lead flight attendant, whose firm tone and indifferent eyes had once enforced arbitrary rules, now reached out gently, not to touch, but to acknowledge. Her face was pale, her voice quiet. She admitted the mistakes. She didn't justify them. And Delilah, without words, acknowledged the moment. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply looked them in the eye, and that was enough. She stepped off the plane into the tunnel, the air thicker now, the silence of the cabin replaced by the hum of the terminal beyond. At the gate, a man in a dark blazer stood waiting, holding a tablet and flanked by two uniformed supervisors. He didn't look at her. He wasn't there for her. As the flight crew exited behind her, he turned, tapped the screen, and quietly guided them away. No scene, no confrontation, just accountability. They followed without protest. She continued forward, her bag in hand, her steps steady. The terminal stretched ahead, and she walked through it without hesitation. She didn't look back. Days passed, then weeks. The incident never made headlines. There were no viral videos, no outraged social media posts, no morning news debates. It had been quiet, just like the flight. But change had begun in silence, and it continued that way. Somewhere inside the airline's headquarters, a review had been conducted. Logs had been pulled. Manifest histories had been traced. Complaints were investigated not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. A memo was drafted. Internal, direct. It outlined new protocols, clearer standards, a renewed focus on bias training, discretion boundaries, and identification handling. At the bottom of that memo, beneath the department headers and signature blocks, was a name, not a shout, not a marketing campaign, just a signature line on policy change. Her name, Delilah Rowan. The note didn't tell her story. It didn't need to. It marked a shift. Not sweeping, not performative, but present. On a different day, in a different airport, she walked through a different terminal. The bustle was familiar. Travelers pulled bags along glossy tile floors. Announcements echoed overhead. Families gathered near gates. She moved unnoticed. No one stared. No one paused. But as she passed a boarding area, a flight attendant standing near the podium caught sight of her, and something shifted. There was no fanfare. Just a moment, a longer glance, a change in expression, a recognition not of celebrity, but of impact. The attendants straightened subtly, adjusted their badge, and continued their work. Delilah passed by without a word, her steps steady, her eyes ahead. She didn't need validation. She didn't need applause. She had never wanted that. What she wanted, she had created. Not revenge, not spectacle, just change. Quiet, permanent, real. And in that stillness, she carried with her something stronger than anger or sorrow. She carried the truth of what had happened, of how dignity had been denied and then reclaimed. Not with rage, not with threats, but with presence, with restraint, with knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. She had walked onto that flight unseen. She had walked off it remembered. And now, as she moved through the world again, no longer carrying the weight of someone else's dismissal, she walked with freedom. The kind that doesn't demand to be noticed, but is impossible to ignore once understood. The end. If this story moved you, let us know by liking and subscribing to support more content like this. I'm curious, what do you think about the direction the plot took? Which moment hit you the hardest? And where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take on Delilah's journey and what you think might happen next.